Good afternoon. Welcome to the Hockey Debates podcast. I'm Bob Duff, your host. I'm joined by Kevin Allen, the esteemed Hall of Fame writer from USA Hockey. And today we're joined by Sascha Paruk from sportsbettingdime.com. He is their lead odds maker and an editor there, and he is our sports betting expert. And today we're going to try a different thing. We're going to, every Thursday going forward with the Hockey Debates podcast, Thursday we're going to talk about hockey betting. And certainly sports betting right now is a huge topic within the industry. You're seeing a massive explosion of legalized sports betting in the United States now that the Supreme Court has overturned an old law that prohibited states other than really Nevada from having sports betting. And Sascha, obviously as someone who's in the industry, what are you seeing how that's changing the landscape?
One of the big things that I'm seeing is that you're getting a lot more options as a sports bettor, even online. The decision from the Supreme Court in Murphy didn't really change how the sort of legal framework of online sports betting sites, which is mainly the realm that I operate in. But the legality of it has just made sports betting in general become more popular, and online betting sites have responded by getting more creative with the types of odds and propositions that they're posting. So when it comes to something like NHL, which is what we're focused on today, you're getting a lot more opportunity to bet on not just individual games and not just futures for something like the Stanley Cup, but individual awards odds. And even within a game, you can now bet on sort of like specific player props a lot more. How many shots on goal is Alex Ovechkin going to have in a certain game? And that's something that has really exploded over the past sort of year, 18 months.
Is hockey betting obviously be huge in Canada? And we know the NFL is the king when it comes to sports betting in North America, but where does hockey kind of rank in the pecking order?
In Canada, it's definitely number two. And it's getting bigger in the United States, in particular because you'll see what sharp bettors consider to be soft markets undergo not necessarily explosions, but certainly growth when they feel that they can find an edge. And so last year in particular, certain sharps realized that there were inefficiencies in the market for a certain aspect of NHL betting, in particular first period overs. So you can actually bet on whether the number of goals in the first period of any game is going to be over or under a certain number. And the sort of long-held belief by sportsbooks was that over under 1.5 goals in the first period was basically an even proposition, and that would be sort of minus 110 either way. But last year, with scoring on the rise, that was not at all the case. And certain sharp bettors were jumping on these overs in the first period, and it sort of it led to quite a bit of growth, in particular with NHL betting last year, just because anytime that professional bettors see an advantage somewhere, they will jump on it. And they did that until sportsbooks adjusted. But it certainly led to growth in NHL betting overall.
Sash, I'd love to get your take on this as someone who's covered the NHL. I thought two elements have sort of brought betting to the forefront in the National Hockey League. Number one, the arrival of the Vegas Golden Knights and the success they had in the first season. There were so many stories, and I wrote a couple of them myself, about how people put a lot of bets on the Golden Knights, and not realizing that they were indeed going to make a run that they did. And secondly, last season there was a lot of publicity around the fact that the St. Louis Blues, as Bob pointed out, were last in the league in January, and one fellow in St. Louis put a $500 bet down, and could win $100,000 if they won the Stanley Cup, and that became a running story throughout the playoffs. And he was offered money for that bet, and I thought that brought so much publicity to the idea of betting that it sort of entered the mainstream. Like now everybody was, I don't know if everybody was betting, but they were all talking about betting. Did that have an impact at all?
I don't know if it had an impact on the overall statistics, on the overall betting handle, but certainly within the betting news world that I occupy, they were massive stories that brought huge attention to the NHL where you previously had not had that. I don't think it was any secret that particularly prior to the missed season, about 10 decades, or more than that now. NHL, particularly in the U.S., was on the decline in terms of popularity. It was being caught by MLS, being passed by NASCAR, and definitely I think that those stories, in particular the Vegas story with people holding tickets at 500 to 1 for the Golden Knights to win the Stanley Cup, brought a ton of attention and increased the popularity of the NHL in the U.S. in particular. I won't say it was ever fading in popularity here in Canada, but certainly in the U.S. it was on the decline for a number of years, and I'm hoping that sort of loss has stopped now.
It also seems lately in the last year or two that the mainstream media is really becoming aware of the whole market of sports betting, and always kind of, it lurked under there. You always saw the point spreads in the NFL games in the paper, and obviously there was horse racing odds, if a city had a track, but it always seemed like it didn't get on the front page, and now it's front page news.
It was a taboo topic because it wasn't strictly legal, and you have Brent Musburger sort of obliquely referencing point spreads late in games, over-unders, and the fact that it's just been legalized has allowed people to talk about it out in the open without feeling like they are tackling a taboo subject, and I think that's awfully refreshing.
What's interesting to me about betting in hockey compared to other sports is I think it's much more difficult and challenging in the NHL to predict the outcome of the postseason. The parity that's now in the National Hockey League really makes it, I don't want to say impossible, because some people do sort of sort it out, but near impossible to kind of sort out even who the favorites are. Like, you have an idea of 8 or 10 teams that are talented enough to make a run, but it's hard to know. Like, I looked at the odds today, and I see as a guy who makes his living analyzing the NHL, I see teams with huge payouts that I think have a legitimate chance to win. And I wonder, have the bettors kind of discovered that you can get good odds, for teams to that have a chance to kind of have big payoffs. But, it's difficult to predict, but you can have a much better chance of a payoff.
Yeah, I think the sheer unpredictability of it is very sort of well known, and I don't think you're seeing a ton of large futures bets being put on big favorites like Tampa Bay, like Vegas, because of that. I was looking at the Stanley Cup futures today, and the Lightning are still plus 800 to win the Stanley Cup. So basically, that, considering, let's pencil them into the 16-team playoffs. All else being equal, all 16 of those teams should have odds of plus 1,500. So basically, sportsbooks are saying that they think the Tampa Bay Lightning have twice as good a chance as an average team, even assuming they make the playoffs, to make a run to the Stanley Cup final. And I don't think that you will see many large bets from sharp bettors on the Lightning because of that, because of how unpredictable the playoffs are, because of the fact that any team that sort of gets into the field seems to have a legitimate chance. There isn't a lot of correlation between having the number one seed in a conference and winning the Stanley Cup.
Well, let's talk about the Lightning. They're obviously off to a slow start. If the playoffs started today, they wouldn't be in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And yet it's kind of odd to think that, they had a great regular season last year, one of the all-time regular seasons, but they also didn't win a single playoff game. And a team that didn't win a single playoff game is the favorite to win the Stanley Cup right now, which is a little bit bizarre, I guess, on one hand. But, Kevin, you cover the NHL. What's your take on the Lightning? Is it just kind of a hangover, or are they going to get it right? And is now the time to jump on them before the odds go down?
Well, I'd actually be a seller right now on the Lightning until I see a little bit more. I didn't think they would be impacted by their early demise last season. It's a veteran team. They're led by a guy like Stamkos, who's been around a long time. Hedman is a real seasoned player. I just assumed they would write that off as, hey, this kind of happens in the NHL playoffs where, if you're not hot at the right time, you can be ousted. But there does seem to be some carryover on this. And now we're all starting to wonder, sometimes poor starts become who you really are. And I think that's what we're kind of waiting to see. I'm sort of looking at the 20-game mark to make any final decisions about the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I've already discovered I had them as reaching the final, and now in the early going, I've moved beyond the Lightning, and I see other teams that I think are performing. In the East, the teams I like better right now are the Washington Capitals. I like the Boston Bruins, better than the Lightning as well. And I think there are kind of some upstart teams that, we have to sort of watch as well to see what's going on. But right now, I get that they're the favorite because I think they have the most talent. But, they're not a team that I would feel comfortable betting on right now.
That's kind of crazy to even make a futures bet at this point. It's almost like throwing a dart at the board, really. I mean, when we look at recent years, like we talked about the Blues, I mean, you go back to Pittsburgh's first of their 2 straight wins. In February of that season, they weren't in the playoffs. So it seems like, as we just discussed, it is kind of a crapshoot now. So to try to pick a team in, the last day of October that's going to win the Stanley Cup seems almost bordering on insane.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And that's sort of what Kevin was alluding to when he says he's looking at the Stanley Cup futures market right now and seeing teams that he thinks have a legitimate shot to win the Stanley Cup down around something like plus 2,200, when, that makes them sort of 3 times less likely to win the Stanley Cup than the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I could not disagree more with that proposition. And like Kevin, I would also be a seller on the Lightning right now. If you look at what they did last year, it was a historically good season, but their underlying metrics do not support that happening again. They were first in the league in PDO. They had the best shooting percentage. They were top 5 in save percentage, and those are statistics that tend to regress. And that's exactly what we've seen this year. If you look at their last 2 games, they won 7-6 last night in New Jersey, and they were outshot something like 45-20. They're not getting the same goaltending they did last year. They are not generating shots. They're not generating that many high danger chances. And so there's very little that I see from the Lightning that tells me, A, they're going to repeat what they did last year just in terms of the regular season, and B, that they are at all statistically better than the other very good teams in the NHL right now, who all have considerably longer odds to win the Stanley Cup.
Obviously, analytics are a huge part of sports in general, but a major part of sports betting when you look at trends and that and how things are talking. You just mentioned a number of trends that are certainly alarming with the Lightning. The thing that surprises me when you talk about trends is there's only been one team that lost the Stanley Cup final and came back the next year to win it since 1984. That was the Penguins in 2009. Yet there's already massive action on the Bruins, and history tells us they're not going to get there. What do you think, Kevin? Are the Bruins legit?
Well, I like the Bruins. I think they're a very good team, and I think they measure up analytically as well. And then if you look at the eye test, they're built for the playoffs. They're a team that can roll into a defensive team the way they play. They've got a coach that seems to be able to relate to his players and vice versa. So I think there's really a lot to like about that. And I think they have a reasonable chance to be as good as they were last season. And they did get to the final. And I think one of the issues that I see, and we've talked about it before we went on the air, about history, is that history is kind of being rewritten in the last couple of years in all sports. I mean, we saw the St. Louis Blues, and we've talked about this. We used to say, well, a bad start, can doom you. Well, it certainly did not doom the St. Louis Blues last season. They were able to kind of march through it. And we just watched an incredible World Series where a team that only won 19 games, or what was it? 1931? What was
1931? Yeah, in their first.
Yeah, 1931 is ended up winning the World Series. So to me, that kind of suggests that as much as we love historical facts, there's certainly room now, at least in the landscape that we are currently in, to see teams not be crushed by poor starts. So. But I do like the Bruins. I would put them on my list. If I had to, though, I like the teams sort of down near the bottom where I think like nobody's paying attention to the Washington Capitals, and they're only a couple years removed. They're essentially the same kind of team. They're still led by the same guys. The big concern was with the loss of Matt Niskanen, who I thought was a pretty important part of that team. like how would they fill that void? And I watched that team, and they filled it fine, and they still seem to be a strong team. And Ovechkin is a strong leader, and he kind of sets the tone for that team. And just yesterday, for example, Bob, and it was a huge story about, or 2 days ago, I should say, when Ovechkin sort of called out the Toronto Maple Leafs. Well, that doesn't affect his team, but maybe it does. I think that to me, it shows the strength he has, and he can pretty much say anything. And I think that team has a swagger and a bravado that allows it to be there. So I would put the Capitals ahead of Boston, but I do love Boston.
I also love Boston, and what Ovechkin said about Toronto really, it signals something pretty important to me, which is that he realized after a number of first-round playoff exits that playing a certain way in the playoffs wasn't likely to produce success. And that's exactly the way that Toronto was playing now, basically in the regular season, and how he expects that they would play and how they have played in past playoffs, and sort of why they haven't been out of the first round for over a decade. And the fact that the leader of the Capitals recognizes that a certain style of play, a very offensively oriented style of play, isn't likely to produce good results in the postseason, and is willing to change his style even at age, I think he's 34, 35 now, is a pretty telling sign that this is a team that is going to enter the playoffs with a good game plan.
And Kevin and I are both old enough to have covered the 96, 97 Red Wings, because we are that old. And they were a team similar to the Lightning. They won 62 games the previous season. At least got to the conference finals before they lost, but still didn't get to the final. And people were asking the same questions about them. And the following year, they didn't get off to a very good start. They didn't have a great year. They weren't terrible. I think they were 6th or 7th in the NHL. But I remember talking to Steve Yzerman around the All-Star break that season. And he said to me, I feel better about this team's chances of winning the Stanley Cup than any team I'd ever been on. And that kind of baffled me, because they were not having a very good regular season. But after they did win, I asked him, why did you believe that? And he said, we were just built better for the playoffs. They had guys like Brendan Shanahan, Marty LaPointe and Darren McCarty had matured into key roles, and they picked up Thomas Sandstrom, another gritty forward, at the trade deadline, and they were tougher to play against. That's what I wonder about the Lightning. It's certainly there with the Leafs, but even the Lightning, they were a team that was winning games. Like you say, they won 7-6 the other night. They won a lot of 6-5 games last year, and that doesn't work in the playoffs. And they didn't really address that in the summer. And the guys they brought in are not, other than, I guess, Patrick Maroon a bit addresses that. But defensively, it doesn't really, Shattenkirk, that's what I'm thinking of coming in. He's kind of what they've already got. They didn't really do anything. And I wonder if a guy they're really missing isn't Antoine Stroman.
Yeah, the Shattenkirk addition, I think, has impacted that team kind of in a negative way. I think they realize that what Shattenkirk does is create offense, and they wanted to take advantage of his skills. They wanted to be just more dynamic. Not that they needed to do that, but I think they wanted to take advantage of him. And I think the team has kind of tried to adjust when he's on the ice, when you watch him play. And, it hasn't worked thus far because, they were already kind of set in their ways and how they play. I thought Hedman has played differently when he's been on the ice with Shattenkirk, because I think he sees him as a guy that is never going to be strong defensively, so I better be a little bit better. But, I think that the Lightning are still capable of doing this, but we sure haven't seen them. I wanted to bring this point up that, before we got into analytics and we had real consistent, measuring points for things, that, we were always hunting around for different ways to kind of assess teams. And I tried to look at the history of good starts, bad starts, and then, if you're hot at the end of the year. And what I discovered, now this was a while ago, but I would say it was probably 7 or 8 years ago, but I could find no correlation between winning the Cup and a good start versus a bad start. And I remember talking to Kenny Howland about, and, he had sort of kept track of that himself when he was in Detroit. And he said, we won it one year when we were playing terribly at the end of the year, and we didn't win it one year when we were playing absolutely awesome. And he said, we've had one Cup when we had a great start, and we had another Cup when we had a poor start. And so, I don't know that we can really glean too much. I think you'd rather be playing better at the end of the season. That's kind of my take on it, but it doesn't really mean that you're guaranteed to win just because you're playing great hockey in late March.
Yeah, I think NHL players are pretty good at hitting the reset button when the playoffs start because it is seen as such a different style of game. As it's a new beginning. It's basically the start of a new season, and it doesn't really surprise me that there's a little correlation between finishing strong and making a deep run.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'll give you a good example on that. We used to say in the 90s, the Devils will be the favorite to win the Cup if they make the playoffs. And it's so silly to say that, but they were not designed for regular season hockey. They were designed to clamp down and play, strong defense in the playoffs. And there are still today teams that I think are much better suited for the playoffs than they are in the regular season. And I think you're absolutely right, Sascha, that you can turn the reset on and just play a completely different brand of hockey in the postseason.
Yeah, and part of that has to do with the officiating. Fewer things get called. There are fewer power plays. There are just fewer chances. And in the grind of an 82-game season, it's not supernatural that certain players wouldn't back check as hard defensively than in a do-or-die Game 7.
So obviously, one of the major uncontrollable factors when you're betting on hockey is going to be injuries. And we've already seen some pretty significant injuries early in the season. We've got, Colorado's lost 2/3 of their top line in Rantanen and Landeskog. St. Louis looks like they'll be without Tarasenko for most of the regular season, if not all. And not as serious, but certainly Toronto is missing John Tavares. I just wondered, Sascha, which of those injuries do you think is most critical and will impact a team's chances to win most significantly?
I think if Landeskog is out for a long period of time, that Colorado is going to struggle to not necessarily record a lot of wins in the regular season, but to make a deep playoff run. He's so vital to them both offensively and defensively. Yes, McKinnon is a Hart Trophy candidate and the most important player on their team, but Landeskog's their captain. Landeskog is a very good two-way player, and they don't still have a lot of forward depth. That top line, when they're together, when you take them apart, and yes, Nazem Kadri on the second line is a nice addition, but still they are one of the most top-heavy teams in the league, and taking out, as you said, 2/3 of that top line is going to be a big problem. And I don't anticipate Rantanen's injury being too long-term of a thing, but Landeskog certainly is very concerning, given that the only timeline they've given so far is indefinitely, and it's the dreaded lower body injury. So his long-term health, I think, is awfully vital to them making any noise in the postseason.
Not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I sure found it odd or coincidental that Tarasenko's injury is going to take him out till the end of the regular season. You can imagine a conversation where Doug Armstrong is saying, how long is he going to be out? Well, I have no way of knowing. The doctor says, so till the end of the regular season, right before the playoffs, right? No, I don't know how it's going. Right, so the end of the regular season will be ready for the playoffs. Like, it's, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's exactly how long this injury is, but that's a perfect situation. And Bob, I know you have, like I have through the years, been told by players that sometimes, when you've been out for a lengthy period of time, you're just fresher. And this is the type of injury Tarasenko's is, that he'll be able to maintain some level, not game conditioning, but some level of conditioning. He'll be able to get on the bike and at least get the legs moving. And so he could end up hitting the ground running. So, that I think the Blues have the kind of team that they can kind of overcome Tarasenko. They've got 4 guys. You look at Schwartz and Shen, kind of leading the way. David Perron as well, getting a point per game, so they can overcome that. And then to have him come back, I think it would give him a lift. I agree about Landeskog. I think he is kind of an inspirational player too, the way he plays. And Rantanen. The thing that scares me about Rantanen is I do not like the week-to-week designation. I think that's what they say when they don't want to say, he's going to be out a long time. They just say week to week, so you got some measure of hope. So I don't like that. But though, I thought the injuries on Colorado, given how they're a trendy team. We're all excited about the Avalanche. Not only do we see them turning the corner in their ability to win, but they're an exciting team. They're a dynamic team. So it'll be interesting to see what the impact will have emotionally, mentally on this Colorado team that I think everybody kind of looks at and says, hey, they're capable of making a long run. There's a lot of talent in that team.
Is there a team out there among these surprising fast starts, Buffalo, Arizona, Edmonton, even a team like Carolina, which a lot of people question, was that last year just kind of a fluke, but they're right there again. Is there a team in that group, Sascha, that looks like a Stanley Cup champion to you?
I would take Carolina among the teams that you mentioned, purely because of the stats I referenced before with the Lightning, things like PDO, things like shot share, Corsi, Fenwick. Those stats just love Carolina. They generate more shots and more chances than the teams that they're playing. And I think Peter Mrazek is a sort of top quality NHL goaltender. I don't think he's going to win the Vezina, but I think he is very capable. I would fade Buffalo as heavily as possible. I do not. I think that team is going to fade into oblivion like they did last year. I love Jack Eichel. I love Rasmus Dahlin. I think in a few years, if they surround them with better secondary players, that they could be a team that has some sustainable success. But I definitely don't see it happening this year.
What about you, Kevin?
Yeah. Well, in a podcast like this, you want to have different.
What happened?
Uh-oh. You still there?
But I do believe in the Carolina Hurricanes. I think a lot of people thought they were a momentum team, but the analytics say that they're everything that we saw last year. They're not a momentum team. I don't have the same level of trust. Very talented player, but I don't know that I believe in him right now. I think he needs still to prove that he's capable of carrying this team over the long run.
Sorry, you cut out for a second there, Kevin. Which player were you talking about?
About Mrazek. I just don't have the faith in him that you do. What's forgotten is that when he first came up, people thought he was going to be a superstar goalie, and so he's got it in him. We know that, but I haven't seen, even last season, he did the job for them, but he was not exceptional. And I think the Carolina Hurricanes would tell you that. He got the job done. But, you need an exceptional goalie. And, he had some help. McIlhenny came along and played well when they needed him to play well. So I think this is an important year for Mrazek as well. But this Carolina team with all the young talent and Svechnikov is a much better player this year than he was last year, and he was exciting last year. And Aho, of course, is good. And Don Waddell has done a good job of replacing the players they've lost. I thought the Eric Holla trade was a terrific trade for that team. So, all those factors. I think of that group that's gotten out of the gate, the kind of the new group. They're the team that I think we should have the most trust in.
Agreed.
Is there a team, Kevin, that is up in the top 10 kind of contenders right now in the Stanley Cup odds? Like, for me, it's the Leafs. I just don't understand. Obviously, the Toronto market plays a lot of role, and I'm sure there's a lot of crazy Leaf fans that bet on the team to win the Cup every year, but I just don't see it. They keep playing the same way, and I think Ovechkin was spot on. They just don't get what they have to do to win in the playoffs, and I don't think it's ever going to happen for them until they figure that out, if they figure that out. Are there teams for either you guys, Kevin or Sascha, that you kind of look at and say, yeah, people got to be crazy to bet on them?
Well, what's interesting about what Ovechkin said is Babcock agreed with him. Mike Babcock came out and said, well, he speaks the truth. I mean, that's exactly right. So there are some teams that like the other way. I see a team like Nashville down as a team that if I had to lay a bet out because I like their odds and I think they have a good shot because I like their defense and I love their goaltending. And, they're averaging 4 goals per game in the early going here. it would be the Nashville Predators. So they're a team that I see in that top 10 group that's getting zero attention, and I think has a shot. I don't see them as a top 3 favorite, but I think they could win it if they got hot.
Who's your sleeper team, Sascha?
I love Nashville as well. I think they are very well built for a playoff run. They are balanced up front. They have an excellent defense score. And Pekka Rinne, I said Peter Mrazek probably isn't going to win the Vezina. I think Pekka Rinne absolutely could. He is playing phenomenally at his advanced age and has really rebounded from sort of a down point in his career a few years ago. So I would absolutely jump aboard the Nashville train as well. And if we get into awards odds later, I think Roman Josi is, if not for John Carlson, the favorite for the Norris.
Well,
what's interesting about the Norris, though, Bob, and I'd love to get your take on this. This has got to be the earliest I've ever heard people mount a Norris candidacy. Obviously Ovechkin is already talking on Twitter about how John Carlson should win. The Capitals organization is kind of making the rounds, trying to let people know what John Carlson has been doing. And I'm going to be fascinated to see if this has any impact because he has not been mentioned in that group. Like, everybody has viewed John Carlson as an exceptional defenseman, but not in the same ilk with guys like Drew Doughty or Giordano or any of those guys, or Hedman, who are in the candidates like every year. He's just on the cusp of that. Like, he was number 4 last year in the balloting. So, it'd be interesting to see if this campaign that his teammates have kind of launched will have an impact.
And I think that's why they're doing it, because they know in general he's not thought of in that class, and they're trying to get his name on the forefront of the minds of the voters. And that we see that in politics. Stay in the news, keep your name out there, and it's all about name recognition. And I think in awards balloting, a lot of it comes down to name recognition too. And unfortunately, we were going to get into the awards today, but we're out of time. We've just flown by here. So next week, join us again next Thursday, and we will go into who we think are going to win the NHL awards, where you should put your money, and some guys maybe off the kind of radar that could be a factor. And so we'll look forward to having you all back next week. Thanks, Sascha. Thanks, Kevin. And this has been the HockeyDebates.com podcast. I'm Bob Duff, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.